Hello, and welcome to another episode of Min's Minute Modcast with his mates. We have a special guest joining us this week. It's Caro from, I was going to say Harrow because that's like where I live, but you're up north. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Very good. Now, and welcome back, regular guests, Satya and Mo.
Thank you, Min.
Now, this week I thought we would do a deeper dive into the whole world of AI, ethics and risk, because it's totally fascinating. And following on from the Minute Modcast I did with Caro, I haven't been able to sort of think about every time I use the AI now. And Caro, what you were explaining about, well, it's all wonderful on the front end, but behind the scenes, there are things that happen in terms of what it costs us in terms of water and energy. And every time I ask ChatGPT, can you explain this blockchain thing? Because I don't really understand it, like a 12-year-old that's using gallons of water, right? And every time I think about that, it's like, actually, I'll just ask my mum instead. That might be easier. So I have a number of questions around that and doing a deeper dive. But to begin with, it'd be great to understand a little bit more around, well, what do you see as one of the biggest risks right now in terms of AI? It's going at a pace. We're going to have ChatGPT 10 probably before we know it. Yeah. What should the world be most concerned about that they might not perhaps really know about right now?
I think the risk, so we've got big tensions coming between the EU and the US, and kind of the US is turning slightly more towards Asia, but not quite China. And there's lots of divisions. And there seems to be a sort of AI arms race going on, especially after the AI Action Summit a couple of weeks ago. Europe has really doubled down on massive investments, 100 million euros from France, 200 million from the EU to build so-called gigafactories, these massive server farms. And I'm not sure that investing in particularly large language models and some of this generative technology, throwing more compute, more resources at it, I'm not sure is going to get us certainly nowhere near artificial general intelligence, if that is a place we want to go, or even to more improved models. There was a piece in Fortune just yesterday was making that exact point, that the lessons are chucking more resources and compute at this isn't improving them. And I had the privilege of listening to Geoffrey Hinton speak a while ago in Geneva, and some of the other top computer scientists who were saying, yeah, if you wanted to achieve artificial general intelligence, LLMs would not be the area of AI we'd advise you to try, because there's a ceiling. These are parametric models, which means they rely on probabilities between tokens and connections. There is a limit to how clever they can get, very clever, but they're not going to achieve anything like kind of insight into this. And you're always going to have issues around hallucinations. So I think that's the risk, that we confuse investment with innovation. And it's why I'm really interested in DeepSeek R1 from China. There are loads of questions about how much power, chips, energy, money was actually used to build the R1 model. China is saying one thing, and there are questions about it. But even if that's not true, what they've done with the model, the developments that they've made, could make such better models much more efficiently, much less energy cost, less water cost, much less resource intensive, using smaller GPUs that don't need all those minerals. That's really exciting. So to answer your question simply, my worry is we've learnt the wrong lessons and we're running off on an arms race, chasing after something that isn't going to give us the feedback that we want and the return that we want, instead of calming, pausing and learning the lessons from DeepSeek, which is fewer resources. Actually, necessity is the mother of all invention, I think.
Another question I have, which I get asked a lot, particularly with a number of the corporates that I get to work with, is everyone's been told, like, okay, like this is the next big disruptive shift. You know, we had, analytics, we had sort of various different technologies. We've been talking about blockchain for a while. And now we have this AI, which is totally going to transform everything. But there's still a bit of a reticence from a lot of companies to actually adopt AI, and for rightful reason. What do you think is kind of holding back people from using more AI in the workplace?
I think two things really. One is it's the risk of the unknown, and part of that is unknown on what the returns will be. So if you invest on a big system, are you actually going to get those returns? But also the risks around, what are my legal risks, my compliance risks? How are my team going to use this? How are the unions going to respond to this? Are my employees going to respond to this? Those are all questions that can be answered and things that can be dealt with information that is out there, and a good program and some thinking around this, a good policy. But I think there's that fear of the unknown. And I think there's also a fear of it simply not being useful. Two things with that. One is, if it's incredibly expensive and it's at the enterprise level, and people tend to think, I need an enterprise level solution to make this work and to make this give me a return on investment, which isn't always true. Some smaller, local, more agentic type systems are actually often more efficient. But if I'm going to invest that, I need to know what the returns are. And I think we're still at the point for a lot of people where you're chasing these bigger systems and they're not necessarily, it's not obvious how they're going to help your business. Whereas some of the smaller language models and more agentic systems, if they're really targeted, and you go into a company and say, well, what do you need help with? Here is a solution. Let's find a problem. But what are your problems? Let's find solutions. I think that can really help companies to adopt AI and to understand what the real benefits are. But it's all about just that, having a problem that needs a solution and not just pulling something off the shelf and trying to plug it in. And I suppose a sneaky third one, and part of that about getting returns, is you need to have your data in really good order for AI to work. And everyone should have that, because you've had the GDPR and data protection law, and everyone should have data logs and data maps and records of processing, and all their data should be in good shape. That isn't necessarily true. And I think a lot of companies are looking at this and thinking, well, to get the maximum benefit, I'm going to have to do so much upfront work in sorting through my data and getting this formatted and transformed and in a good position to be able to use the AI. That I think that's putting companies off as well. But again, it's a solvable problem. I suspect that's what it is. That's what I'm hearing anyway from organizations.
Yeah, something I wasn't aware of until we spoke the other week was, again, in preparing these models that seem absolutely amazing if you just see the headlines. I didn't realize you have, like, behind the scenes, all of these people who are having to sort of transform that data in not the best environment and being exploited, in essence, as to doing that. Can you say a little bit more about some of the research you've been doing in that space?
Thank you, because this is something I'm really passionate about. So this is really data enrichment workers, and it's a scandal, actually. It's a huge global scandal, and it gets hardly any headlines, and not many people talk about it because it's uncomfortable and it's inconvenient. So this is really the army of workers, tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people around the world. We don't know how many, because it's really hard for researchers to go to countries where this is happening and find out. People are scared for their jobs and their livelihood. But this is a huge number of people whose job it is to take data that might be scraped from the internet, might be provided by a company, that might be coming back from an automated vehicle, whatever it is, and quality check it, label the data. That's a huge part of the task. This is a picture of a cat. This is a picture of a dog. This text means this. So labeling the data, transforming it, quality checking it, and getting it ready. And it's a huge task. And Sam Altman himself has said that it takes millions and millions of human hours to produce this data. Where he's a bit less transparent is who is doing that for how much money and in what conditions. So the AI Labour Disclosure Initiative, which is from the International Labour Organization, so part of the UN, has got a big project on this and is doing work on it. There's also an organization called Data Lab, and Professor Antonio Casilli, who I've heard speak a few times and is fantastic on this. And I have a little clip on this on my website, which has him speaking in part of it. He kindly let me use that and show it to people. And he has looked into a lot of this and trying to map not just the data flows, which is a big data protection issue, but also where the people are, what conditions they're working in. And it's simply incredible. You have people who are working 100 people in one house, one toilet per house. They're burning garbage in the front yard. There might be one or two computers. They're paid less than $2 an hour to sort through this data, produce this content. Some are involved in reinforcement learning through human feedback, so might be checking what models have done. Others are involved in imitating AI. So, for example, if you have a fancy AI security system that will text message you if it spots that someone has just shoplifted from your shop, it's often a human being sitting in usually parts of the global south, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, watching the footage and texting you back. It's really quite shocking, and it's having a bigger impact actually on whole economies, because people with STEM qualifications and PhDs, so the entrepreneurs of the future, are getting stuck doing this gig work, this data gig work, and not building companies. So it's having a huge impact, but it's something we just don't want to talk about because it's deeply inconvenient and it undermines the narrative of how wonderful AI systems are just on their own magically.
Wow. Yeah, totally shocking. And yeah, it's great you're bringing a light onto these sorts of topics.
So, Caro, thank you for all the insights. One question I do have is about the AI policy making. So we see that Europe is quite focused on creating these policies around AI and ethics and regulation. However, we also see that many countries are also at competition to create better and better AI models. And it is like, my question is, are policies catching up, or are they playing the catching up game, or are they ahead of their time, already overlooking at what might come in the future? Because the competition is so fierce, right?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and a very timely one, actually. So we had the AI Action Summit in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and JD Vance, Vice President of the United States, was excoriating. He was so critical of the EU for its over-regulation. He didn't cite the AI Act, interestingly. He cited the Digital Services Act, which is part of the online safety agenda, but he didn't cite the Act. Absolutely excoriating. And immediately afterwards, the EU dropped a piece of legislation that was proposed around liability for AI. So the AI Liability Directive was scrapped the next day. So there's different tensions there. I think what I would say, just to give a bit more context to that, the US has a lot of AI legislation. It just tends to be at the state level. So a lot of states, there are 3 or 4, depending on how you count, but Utah, Colorado, and California have comprehensive AI legislation, and 40-something states have legislation on some aspect of AI. So the US is heavily regulated on AI. It's just at the state level, at the federal level rather, that's been rolled back slightly by President Trump, although President Biden did pass an executive order that was putting in place some safeguards, and there was bipartisan support in the House for regulation. So where does that leave us in terms of innovation versus regulation? I think 2 things. One, the regulation that's coming out of the EU in particular is trying to be adaptable. So it's based on principles, but it's also based on standards, and technical standards are easier to update and amend than regulation. An actual regulation or a directive, whichever flavor your legislation takes at the EU level, takes a long time. It's got to get through the parliament. It takes a huge amount of time for all these countries to agree on the text. Standards are a bit quicker, they're a bit faster. They're standards bodies themselves, who are technical experts, can draft them and prepare them. Standards under the Act have taken quite some time. They're due in April, but they've been going a while debating these. So we'll see if what I've just said is true in the long run. But that's the idea, that you've got some technical standards, things that are easier to update and adapt very quickly. And then you've got more principle-based legislation that empowers regulators to take a kind of holistic principles-based view. That's the idea behind the Act. We'll see how it's enforced and put into practice, but that's how it's trying to stay up to date and adaptable and ahead of the technology. The last thing I'd say, the last component on this, is around regulation as a blocker to innovation, because that's what JD Vance was saying, and that's the argument that's made. You can't regulate because then people can't innovate. And I think to look at that, I'd give 2 examples. One is the US tech market. So there was a piece in Fortune just yesterday that I mentioned that was saying, these models are plateauing, more compute, more resources, more energy isn't really getting us much development. On the other hand, you have China and the DeepSeek R1 model, which it's not clear what chips they had access to. It's not clear how much energy, how much money, what resources they had. So it's disputed whether it was quite so cheap. And even if they did have all those resources, what they've produced are models that can literally be run in small distilled form on some desktop computers. You can download and run an 80 billion parameter model on some desktop computers that have AI GPUs. And that technology is now in the hands of millions and millions of developers, researchers, academics, scientists who wouldn't have had access to it. So even if what China's said about the resources aren't true, they've produced something that does use a lot less in terms of resources. And they've done it not because they had no regulation, but because they had tons of it. China's heavily regulated in terms of technology and AI, and they had all the sanctions from the US as well with chips. And it was because of those constraints on them that the data scientists at DeepSeek innovated. And so I think that's a lesson as well. Yes, regulation has to keep up with innovation, but regulation also fosters innovation. And I think that's something that we really shouldn't miss as we get lost in this arms race.
I'm going to ask a question on behalf of my daughter as well. She's an artist, a graphic designer, and every time I go to a room and I'm like, my God, look at this like really cool thing that I've done. She's like, Dad, thanks. I've spent years learning this stuff, and here it is. My question is around ethics primarily. A lot of these models were obviously trained on what was there on the internet in terms of, what I think is really sort of proprietary information, be that music, be that art, etc. And now obviously there's things that some of the larger AI companies are saying, well, actually, if it's out there, we kind of, have access to it, and that's kind of in the public domain, etc. From a sort of legal standpoint, but also probably more importantly from an ethics perspective, that thing of just because you can, does it really mean that you should? Because I'm some amazing music using some of these tools, but again, who's actually really getting the reward for that in terms of compensation and all of the hard work that creatives have done? So I'd love your perspective, and also Mo, yours as well, because I know you use a lot of these tools, as to what your view is on on the ethics of actually using these models. But let's start with you, Caro.
No, it's a really important point, and it's one that's being litigated by the New York Times suing OpenAI. Other lawsuits are coming against other. Anthropic, I think, is being sued. Other companies are having litigation against them on grounds of copyright.
And the music companies as well, right? I think Spotify's got some big lawsuits as well.
Right. Yes, there's a number of lawsuits here, and there was a judgment just last week, I believe, in the First Circuit in the US that seemed to side with the copyright holders, so not the tech companies, but the copyright holders. In the UK, we don't have any comprehensive AI legislation, but we've been debating the possibility of it. And a lot of creatives, the likes of Stephen Fry, actors, writers, are coming out and saying, this is theft. We are not getting paid. This is theft. And we need regulation to prevent companies from doing this. At the same time, if you have regulation, you need regulators to enforce it. And I remember just last March, which probably seems like a lifetime ago right now, it does to me, with everything moving so fast. But the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK was saying that they probably wouldn't look to enforce data protection breaches, historical ones, but they might going forwards in terms of sucking up this data, because that's another big question when you have journalistic material. Data protection laws are a bit different for that in terms of AI models. So I think it is a big issue. And related to it, of course, is the issue of deep fakes and misinformation as well. Yeah. And how do you know that what you're looking at is genuine? And so there's a lot of laws globally, particularly around misinformation and elections or sexually explicit deepfakes, that seek to challenge that. And the US states that are really leading on this. My favorite is the Ensuring Likeness, Voice and Image Security Act of Tennessee, known as the ELVIS Act, which gives a lot of powers to individuals to protect their likeness from being reused by AI and regenerated. But I think it is a big issue. OpenAI hasn't been talking about this openly for a while, but a year ago they were talking about some kind of payment model, and they did all these deals with publishers like the Financial Times, the Atlantic, these big publishers, to get access to their content and use. It wasn't clear whether it was going to be some kind of RAG, results augmented generation system, to attribute what comes back to publishers and then push you to their paywall. I read their announcements and thought, this sounds like a search engine. And lo and behold, they announced they would be doing a search engine. So that's gone a bit quiet. OpenAI was certainly keen on settling this and finding a way to compensate creatives, or at least their companies. But it has gone a bit quiet right now. So I'm not sure where we are, but certainly it's a huge issue, and another one that shouldn't get lost in this kind of arms race that we seem to be in, because it is a major problem.
Yeah. Mo, what's your perspective as a user, but also from an ethics perspective?
Yeah, so we do develop and create AI solutions. We enable businesses in my business for them to use AI tools to enhance their processes and so on. So I'm full on, it makes sense. We shouldn't potentially use other people's data, right, without any kind of reference to them. But I remember when Midjourney was out, after a while, I think they got sued right? Because they were using all the art and everything.
That's right. Everything looked like Banksy. Yeah.
Exactly. But there is another factor to this as well, which is if you are doing it as a normal artist, you still get inspired by other people's art. So there is a reference that even unconsciously you take from other people's art, your inspirations, and so on. So there's an argument against it that, well, is it the same? Well, it's not exactly, but still, even in the normal way, you still do have elements of it, of using other people's techniques or ideas and bringing it into your own and trying to make it your own. Right. But one thing in my clients that with my clients that we work with, they care about their data a lot. So whoever I go to, they're like, how do we not allow AI to train on our data? Can we make it more local? Can we separate it? And that's actually how we implement most of our solutions, depending on the industry and so on. But literally everyone asks for that. For the future, like Spotify, which they started off a little bit iffy, now starting to pay their celebrities, their music writers, and whoever is doing the singing and so on. Something like this might be created for AI. I'm seeing this happening in the next 5-10 years. I don't know when, but it'll be like an AI market space, but still people getting compensated for their work and so on. So I see a future like that happening at some point, but let's see.
Brilliant. Time is ticking, so I'm going to ask one final question, which is, Caro, you spend a lot of time at the BBC, sort of being asked various questions. Can I have the name of your agent, please? Because if next time they have a topic doing dad jokes that they need to do a thing on, then I'm your man. But seriously, can you just give us a couple of examples of the sorts of things that you've discussed on the BBC News?
Yeah, no, thank you for that plug. Yeah, I've been on the BBC News a couple of times and on Times Radio and a few of the bigger outlets talking about privacy and security in particular. So one story that I was interviewed on the BBC a couple of times about was the latest in encryption and Apple refusing to comply with, we seem to be, we don't know, it's all very secretive, but Apple seems to have just withdrawn a product from the UK market rather than comply with an order from the UK government to put in some kind of, we don't know, backdoor to its encrypted systems. I was commenting on that a bit for the BBC, and then having a debate on Times Radio about it with the amazing Matthew Feeney from Big Brother Watch, kind of arguing about privacy and surveillance more generally. So yeah. No, it's really great actually to I've always wanted to do that as a kid. You know, as a kid, you always want to be like on the news or something. So it's been really good. But thank you for bringing that up, then.
No worries at all. Right, well, let's call it a day there. So thank you very much for today's podcast. See you all again soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.